The projector rattled softly in the dim barrack hall. Its beam cut through cigarette smoke and winter air, casting trembling light across a wall where a white sheet hung like a flag of surrender. Rows of German women sat motionless on wooden benches, former Luftwaffe clerks, Wehrmacht auxiliaries, and officers stripped of rank and insignia. Their uniforms had been replaced with coarse gray prison wool, yet their posture remained rigid, shoulders straight, jaws tight. A British sergeant turned the handle on the projector, and the first frames flickered to life. Allied tanks rolling through the ruins of Berlin, cheering crowds in Paris, flags rising over bombed cities. The women's eyes followed every scene in silence. For years, they had seen victory in propaganda reels, glorious marches, triumphant speeches, and Hitler's promises of destiny. Now they saw truth instead: corpses, hunger, surrender. The sound crackled, echoing off the concrete walls, and somewhere in the back, a single woman lowered her head. The rest stared forward, faces drained of certainty, trapped between disbelief and humiliation. Outside, cold wind swept across the camp fences, carrying with it the faint sound of a free world awakening. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, the war's end was not an explosion of triumph for the defeated. It was a long, suffocating silence. Across the shattered landscape of Europe, the Reich's symbols were torn down, its banners burned, and its officers, male and female alike, were gathered into barbed wire enclosures that stretched from France to Poland. Among these prisoners were thousands of women who had once served the German war machine with pride and conviction. Auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe, nurses of the Wehrmacht, clerks, radio operators, and communication officers. Many had never seen the front lines, but had lived surrounded by propaganda that told them Germany was destined to prevail. They had written reports, decoded messages, and treated the wounded with the belief that every sacrifice was part of a noble struggle. The war's end shattered that illusion. The Allied powers now faced an enormous challenge, not only to rebuild Europe, but to reorient the minds of those who had lived under a totalitarian regime. In the British and American zones, one of the most effective tools of this psychological operation was film. Motion pictures had played a central role in both the rise and fall of Nazi ideology. The Third Reich had used cinema as a weapon: newsreels glorifying victories, documentaries showcasing racial superiority, and films designed to inspire loyalty to Hitler. Now the Allies intended to reverse that narrative using the same medium. Across captured German territories, Allied psychological warfare divisions set up re-education programs aimed at confronting prisoners with the reality of the war's consequences. British and American officers believed that words alone could not penetrate years of propaganda. Only visual evidence could. Thus began the screenings. Carefully chosen footage compiled from Allied camera units, news correspondents, and liberated territories. These were not Hollywood productions, but raw documentary reels shot by war correspondents embedded with the advancing armies. They showed the truth: the rubble of Berlin, the liberation of Paris, and the haunting liberation of concentration camps. At the time, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In the British zone, several camps housed captured female personnel, including those from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht Women's Auxiliary Corps. Camps such as Recklinghausen, Hohenfels, and Lübeck became centers for a quiet but powerful experiment: moral rehabilitation through confrontation. Prisoners were made to attend lectures, participate in discussions, and, most memorably, watch Allied victory newsreels. To the Allied officers overseeing these programs, these films were more than education; they were mirrors. The first screenings began in late summer 1945. Reports from British field officers describe women entering makeshift theaters reluctantly, some mocking, others defiant. For years, these women had served a cause they were told was righteous and inevitable. The collapse of the Reich had left them disoriented. Their officers had vanished, Hitler was dead, and the propaganda ministry that once told them Germany's destiny was divine was now silent. The Allies wanted them to see what their nation had truly become. The films they showed were part of a larger operation coordinated by the British Ministry of Information and the U.S. Army Pictorial Service. Titles like The Battle of Britain, The Fall of Berlin, and Nazi concentration camps were distributed across occupied zones. The footage was unflinching. It showed the twisted wreckage of German cities, entire streets reduced to skeletons of brick and smoke. It showed Allied troops raising flags over bombed-out government buildings. And most painfully, it showed the liberation of camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. For many German women, it was their first glimpse of the atrocities committed in their country's name. The Allies understood the emotional gravity of these screenings. They did not seek revenge but reflection. Female prisoners were chosen specifically for these viewings because they represented a generation that had lived entirely within the Nazi social order, educated, indoctrinated, and employed by it. They were witnesses to bureaucracy, not battle, and yet they had been instrumental in keeping the machine running. Watching the Allied newsreels was intended to dismantle not just the Nazi ideology, but also the emotional walls built around it. At first, many refused to believe what they saw. They insisted that the films were propaganda, the very kind they had once helped to create. When Allied officers paused the reels to explain that the footage had been captured by neutral or even German cameramen, silence usually followed. One British field report described the reaction at a screening in Lübeck. At the start, several women laughed quietly. When the concentration camp footage appeared, one fainted. Others stared at the floor. At the end, they requested to see the film again. The process was slow, uneven, but deeply human. To understand the shock of these moments, one must recall the total control of information inside Nazi Germany. From 1933 to 1945, the Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, had engineered an alternate reality. Every radio broadcast, every newspaper article, every newsreel reinforced the idea of German moral superiority and inevitable victory. Even as the Allies bombed Berlin and Soviet forces advanced on the Eastern Front, many civilians believed the Reich still had secret weapons that would turn the tide. To those women in uniform, defeat was inconceivable until the day it arrived. The Allied newsreels tore through that illusion frame by frame. Life inside the POW camps was a reflection of this transformation. The early months were marked by uncertainty. Female officers who had once held authority now lined up for rations, shared barracks with dozens of others, and worked under Allied supervision. Food was scarce, temperatures dropped at night, and letters from home revealed that cities were gone, families scattered, and futures uncertain. Many clung to fragments of belief that the Reich might rise again, that the Allies were exaggerating, that they had been betrayed by their leaders. The screenings were designed to dismantle that last defense. British and American officers overseeing these programs were often young themselves, many barely in their 20s, veterans of Normandy or North Africa. They had seen the horrors firsthand. For them, showing the newsreels was not about punishment but about exposing truth. Each frame carried weight. The ruins of Hamburg, the dead in Berlin's subway tunnels, the faces of liberated prisoners who could barely stand. These images were undeniable. They required no translation. By the end of 1945, the screenings had become routine in camps across the British zone. Reports noted gradual changes in prisoner behavior. Conversations grew quieter. Some began asking for English-language books or newspapers. Others volunteered for work in nearby towns, cleaning debris and helping distribute food to civilians. The humiliation of seeing defeat was transforming into a kind of awakening, a slow, painful reckoning with reality. Still, for many, the shame lingered deeply. Seeing Allied soldiers celebrated on screen, the same armies that had destroyed their homeland, was unbearable. Yet that humiliation was precisely the catalyst the Allies intended. It forced acknowledgement, then reflection. In the words of one American officer stationed near Hanover, they needed to see what the world saw. Only then could they begin to live in it again. The re-education programs extended far beyond film. There were lectures about democracy, civic responsibility, and human rights. Newspapers like Die Neue Zeitung, published under Allied supervision, became tools for spreading truth. But it was the newsreels that left the most lasting mark. Moving images, flickering on canvas screens, carried the weight of reality in a way no words could. By late 1946, the Allies considered these programs largely successful. Many of the women released from the camps would later describe the experience as transformative, a brutal but necessary encounter with truth. Yet for others, it left lasting bitterness. They could not forget the feeling of being forced to confront their nation's guilt in such a public, humiliating way. Still, history shows that this confrontation, as painful as it was, played a vital role in shaping post-war Germany's collective conscience. Inside those camp halls, beneath the hum of the projectors and the dim flicker of light, the process of moral reconstruction had begun. What had started as forced humiliation would soon evolve into reluctant understanding. And from that understanding, slowly, a new kind of identity would emerge, one no longer bound to lies but to truth itself. The Allied officers knew that this transformation could not happen overnight. It would take years of effort, countless discussions, and the courage to face what had been denied. But it all began in that quiet, darkened room, where the screen showed victory and the watchers saw themselves defeated. The flicker of the projector light became, over time, more than a tool of exposure. It became a weapon of redefinition. The Allies understood that rebuilding a nation required first dismantling the myths that had built it, and for that purpose, film proved more potent than any pamphlet or lecture. The angles of this transformation, both psychological and ideological, lay in how the moving image pierced denial, reshaped identity, and exposed the deepest contradictions of those who had served under the Reich. To the captured German female officers, these films were not just pictures of defeat, they were mirrors that showed them what their loyalty had hidden. The first layer of the Allied strategy was simple: confrontation through evidence. Newsreels such as Germany surrenders, the road to Berlin, and the death mills were shown repeatedly to groups of prisoners. The reels were brief, usually no longer than 20 minutes, yet their impact was profound. The women sat in rows, faces lit by ghostly frames showing the same streets they once walked, now reduced to ash. Berlin's skyline, once the heart of the Reich, was nothing but skeletal steel and crumbling stone. Columns of refugees moved like shadows through the ruins, children dragging suitcases larger than themselves. The narration, calm, British or American, spoke with quiet finality. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12. That sentence lingered like smoke in the air. At one screening in the British zone, Allied officers documented a group of former Luftwaffe communications staff who had served in Western Europe. Their reactions reflected a pattern seen across camps. At first, defiance, folded arms, averted eyes, murmurs of disbelief. Then silence, followed by an almost visible collapse of composure. One woman, identified in a report only as Elsa M., whispered that the footage of Dachau must have been fabricated. When the Allied officer told her the cameraman was German, captured with his own film rolls, she reportedly stared at the floor and said nothing further. Others broke into tears, especially during scenes showing the faces of emaciated prisoners staring directly into the lens. For many, it was the first time they realized that their country's glory had been built on industrialized suffering. The Allied approach was not accidental. Psychological warfare experts like Brigadier General Robert A. McClure, who oversaw information control in occupied Germany, designed the screenings as part of reorientation campaigns. These efforts aimed to make Germans see themselves not as victims of defeat, but as participants in a moral catastrophe. To achieve this, they used film as both documentation and moral reckoning. The female prisoners were considered particularly significant audiences. Many had been part of the Reich's bureaucratic backbone, the unseen network of typists, nurses, and code operators that sustained the regime. They had been educated under the Hitler youth system, which taught them that obedience was virtue and that the Führer was the embodiment of destiny. To them, defeat was not only national but spiritual. The newsreels shattered that illusion in front of their eyes. Every reel followed a deliberate rhythm. It began with the rise of Allied power, factories humming in the United States, soldiers training in Britain, ships crossing the Atlantic. Then came the victories: Normandy, Paris, the Rhine. The narration emphasized unity and humanity, Allied soldiers helping civilians, nurses treating the wounded regardless of nationality. Finally, the camera turned to Germany's destruction. Cities burned, soldiers surrendered, civilians dug through rubble. The message was clear. The war had not been lost to betrayal or bad luck, but to moral failure. When the lights came back on, the silence that followed was deeper than any lecture could have achieved. Yet not all reactions were contrition. Some women clung fiercely to denial. A few whispered that the Allies had manipulated the footage, that the bodies in the camps were actors, or that the Jews had brought this upon themselves. Decades of indoctrination could not be undone in an hour. The British officers, however, noted that even those who resisted belief could not look away. Exposure, they believed, was the first step toward erosion. Repetition would do the rest. Over the months, the screenings continued. Reels changed, but the effect deepened. Slowly, the women's confidence eroded into reflection. Beyond the moral confrontation, there was another layer to the humiliation: gender. The Nazi regime had presented German womanhood as pure, dutiful, and devoted to service of the fatherland. These women had been trained to believe they were protectors of culture and motherhood. To now be seated in a cold barrack watching Allied women in uniform, pilots, mechanics, war correspondents, was itself an affront to their identity. The American and British women who appeared in the reels were free, confident, and equal participants in their nation's victories. They smiled, saluted, flew planes, drove tanks, and directed soldiers. For the German women, this sight carried both disbelief and shame. Their ideology had told them women's strength was submission. Now they saw a different kind of power, one unchained by obedience. Allied officers noticed this psychological fracture. Reports from the U.S. military government in Germany mentioned that female POWs expressed confusion when shown footage of American women serving in uniform. They had been told Allied women were weak, immoral, or manipulated by propaganda. Instead, they saw them leading medical units, handling logistics, and standing beside male officers as equals. In many screenings, this part of the film stirred visible discomfort. To lose the war was one humiliation. To see that the enemy's women had more freedom and respect was another entirely. The moral defeat intertwined with social revelation. Film was not the only medium used. Photographs, pamphlets, and Allied newspapers were distributed, often showing images of American nurses comforting German children or British relief workers handing out food to civilians. The contrast was undeniable. For those who had been taught that Germans were the world's civilized example, the realization that their conquerors were more humane was devastating. The process of unlearning took root not in lectures but in glances: a nurse's hand on a child's shoulder, a pilot's calm face under the caption, "Women of the Free Nations." There was also the matter of timing. In 1945 and 1946, Germany was not yet stable. Cities remained in ruins, millions were homeless, and hunger defined daily life. These conditions amplified the emotional impact of the newsreels. Watching Allied prosperity and discipline while sitting in cold barracks made defeat feel tangible. The women realized that the regime that had promised them supremacy had left them starving and forgotten. The juxtaposition of pride and ruin created a quiet despair that the Allies harnessed carefully, pushing toward introspection rather than revolt. One British psychological officer described the change in a report to London. At first they carried themselves like officers still. By the third screening they sat like widows. It was not physical punishment that subdued them but exposure to truth. The projectors, humming in low light, replaced the podiums and loudspeakers of the Third Reich. Instead of slogans, they offered evidence. Instead of ideology, they offered images too real to deny. The transformation was slow but visible. Some women began asking to learn English, hoping to read Allied newspapers or watch subtitled newsreels again. Others requested to write letters to relatives in Allied custody, expressing remorse or confusion. The guards, who had once viewed them as cold and unrepentant, began to see them as human beings wrestling with the collapse of belief. A few even volunteered to assist Allied nurses treating displaced persons. These small gestures did not erase guilt, but they marked the fragile beginning of moral reconstruction. The Allies had discovered, perhaps without fully it, the power of cinematic truth. The same medium the Nazis had used to control minds now served to liberate them. The women who had once written reports for Goebbels' propaganda offices were now learning from images that contradicted every lie they had helped to spread. This inversion, film as redemption rather than deception, became one of the defining methods of post-war psychological rehabilitation. There were moments, however, that transcended strategy, moments purely human. An American officer once described a screening in which the reel jammed, freezing on a frame showing an Allied soldier offering bread to a German child. The machine clattered, the image stayed, and for a long minute the women simply stared. Some cried quietly. In that still frame, the war ended again, not in surrender but in understanding. Each of these screenings was a small battle, not of armies but of conscience. The Allies won them not with bombs or guns but with light projected onto canvas, truth flickering across faces long trained to deny it. For those German women, humiliation turned into recognition, recognition into grief, and grief into the first stirrings of renewal. The newsreels had done what the war could not. They made the invisible visible. By early 1946, the Allied command noted measurable psychological changes among prisoners who had undergone repeated screenings. When questioned, many admitted that the war had been unjust or that Hitler's promises had been lies. A few confessed that they had felt pride when first captured, believing their service was but that pride had since become shame. The transformation was incomplete but undeniable. The moving image had broken the stillness of denial. The light of the projector, once a symbol of control under the Reich, had become the tool of liberation. The women who watched could no longer what they had seen. The reels continued to roll, frame by frame, until even the last remnants of illusion were burned away by the brightness of truth. The confrontation had begun. But the true test, what would come after those screens went dark, was only just beginning. The room was darker than before. The generator hummed somewhere outside, and the projector's beam cut through a faint haze of dust. This was no longer the first screening. Weeks had passed. The German women had seen the films more than once, but tonight something different awaited them. Allied officers had brought a new reel, one compiled from captured German footage, newsreels that once played in theaters across the Reich. For the first time, the women would watch their own propaganda, followed by the Allied counterfilms that revealed its deception. The contrast would shatter whatever illusions still survived. The screen opened on familiar images: Hitler at Nuremberg, rows of banners, gleaming helmets reflecting torchlight. The women straightened instinctively, recognizing the grandeur, the rhythm, the precision. They had lived in that world, the perfect choreography of power. But the reel didn't stop there. The next sequence was Allied footage of the same cities, now silent, destroyed, smoldering. The same plazas they had cheered in were now littered with rubble and corpses. The announcer's calm English voice said only, "This is what those lights became." The sound of the projector deepened, and one woman covered her mouth. The illusion of glory dissolved. For many, that was the moment the war truly ended. Not with surrender, but with recognition. The films no longer showed just defeat. They showed betrayal. Everything they had believed about the Reich's invincibility, about its moral purpose, had been undone by their own eyes. Some of them had joined the Wehrmacht auxiliaries to serve their country. Others had enlisted for security, for belonging or for duty. Now they saw that they had served something monstrous. The air inside the barrack turned heavy. The Allied officer in charge, Captain Lawrence, a calm man from Manchester, stood silently in the back, watching faces more than film. He later wrote in his report, "The propaganda they had served was being used against them. For the first time, they saw themselves not as victims of defeat, but as participants in lies." Then came the reel that no one forgot, the one titled Nazi Concentration Camps. It had been compiled by Allied cameramen and authenticated by the Nuremberg Tribunal. The film began without music or narration, just sound, wind, footsteps, and the low hum of soldiers breathing through masks. The first images were of Buchenwald. The camera panned slowly across rows of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood. The women in the barracks stopped breathing. For years, they had been told that stories of camps were enemy propaganda. But these were not actors. These were faces, bones, names. The camera lingered on a small sign. Arbeit macht frei. The same phrase many of them had written in reports or typed on forms without thought. The footage continued. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Nordhausen. Liberated prisoners stared blankly at the camera, their eyes hollow, their limbs too weak to stand. Allied soldiers handed them food, water, blankets. The narration finally began, low and restrained. This is what was found behind the walls of Germany's victory. The screen shook slightly as the reel advanced, and one woman fainted. Another whispered, "Das kann nicht sein." This cannot be. But no one answered her. When the lights came on, there was no sound. The silence was the kind that lives inside the chest, not between people but within them. For several minutes no one stood. The British sergeant operating the projector waited for an order that didn't come. Captain Lawrence simply said, "Leave it off." Then he stepped outside. The guards reported later that many of the women sat for nearly an hour afterward, unmoving. One eventually began to weep quietly. Another stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. The following days in camp were unlike any before. Routine continued, roll call, meals, assignments, but the energy had changed. The arrogance that once filled the air was gone. A nurse from Munich, formerly a proud member of the Reich's Red Cross division, refused her ration one morning, saying she could not eat while others starved. A communications officer, who had once boasted about intercepting Allied transmissions, spent hours sitting outside, sketching faces from memory, faces she said looked like the ones in the film. These were small, private acts of reckoning, but they mattered. The Allied command, however, did not stop with one screening. They organized follow-ups, lectures, open discussions, written reflections. The women were asked what they thought of the films. Many refused to speak. Some said they felt deceived, not by the Allies but by their own government. A few expressed rage, not at the enemy but at the betrayal of belief. One report noted, the emotional fracture was total. What they had been proud of became a source of shame overnight. The same propaganda that once inspired devotion now served as evidence of delusion. At Nuremberg, the trials had begun. Newspapers carried photographs of German leaders sitting in the dock, men who once commanded entire divisions now staring at their boots. The female prisoners were shown newsreel excerpts from the courtroom. They watched Göring, Hess, and Kaltenbrunner listen as footage of the camps was played for the world. The judges' voices echoed through the speakers in English and German. For many women in the barracks, this was the final collapse. The same men whose portraits had hung in their offices were now being condemned by their own documents, their own films, their own crimes. Among the most striking sequences was footage of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. British soldiers, pale with shock, used bulldozers to bury the dead. In one report, an Allied psychologist noted that female prisoners reacted most strongly to this reel. They wept not for the dead, he wrote, but for the realization that they had been part of a system that allowed it. The emotional impact was immense. Some begged to leave, others asked to work in relief efforts. In later months, a small number of former German nurses volunteered to assist in Allied-run hospitals for displaced persons. The process of redemption had begun, fragile, uncertain, but real. Meanwhile, outside the camp fences, Germany itself was undergoing its own confrontation with truth. Cities were clearing rubble, families were searching for missing relatives, and radio broadcasts carried news of war crimes trials daily. The same films shown to POWs were now being screened in German cinemas under Allied supervision. Audiences sat in silence as the horrors unfolded, the faces of victims, the ruins of their own cities. For the first time, Germans were forced to watch history unfiltered. It was a collective awakening, one that began in barracks like these. But inside those POW compounds, the personal dimension was more profound. For the female officers, humiliation became internalized. Their uniforms had already been taken, their ranks erased. Now their convictions were being dismantled. They were no longer the symbols of Germany's discipline or purity. They were witnesses to its moral collapse. Some resisted to the end, clinging to the notion that the Allies were victors only by chance, that Germany's ideals had been right even if its execution had been wrong. But even among the defiant, doubt had begun to fester. Once planted, it grew silently, reshaping everything. One night, weeks after the final screening, a storm swept across the camp. The power failed and the projector fell silent mid-reel. The image froze, a single frame showing the Allied flag over Berlin. For minutes, the wind howled outside while the women sat in darkness, staring at that half-lit flag. The guard said no one spoke. It was as if the entire camp understood that this frozen image was the new reality, the final scene of their world. The transformation that followed was subtle but irreversible. The women began to talk among themselves, not of revenge or restoration, but of meaning. Why had they believed so completely? Why had they never questioned? Some spoke of childhood indoctrination, of loyalty born from fear. Others confessed they had simply wanted to belong. The Allies' strategy had achieved what force never could. It made them think. In one of the last documented screenings, a reel titled "Germany Under Reconstruction" was shown. It depicted German civilians rebuilding roads, planting crops, reopening schools. Women in plain dresses swept rubble from the streets while Allied soldiers handed out bread. This was not humiliation, it was renewal. For the first time, the German women in the audience saw a future that was not defined by uniform or obedience, but by work, survival, and reconciliation. When the film ended, one of them, an ex-Wehrmacht clerk named Hilda, turned to the guard and said quietly, "Maybe this is what victory should look like." The officer simply nodded. That was the turning point, the transition from humiliation to reflection. The Allied films had begun as a weapon of truth, but they ended as instruments of rebirth. In confronting the darkest images of their nation, these women had seen something unexpected, the possibility of rebuilding not through pride, but through humility. The projectors would stop one day. The barracks would empty, but the images would stay. The faces of the camps, the ruins of Berlin, the Allied soldiers helping the wounded, they would live on in memory long after the reels decayed. The war of armies had ended, but the war for truth had just begun. When the screenings finally ended, silence returned to the camps, a silence different from the uneasy quiet of captivity. It was no longer the stillness of resistance, but of reckoning. The Allied officers noticed the change long before the prisoners spoke of it. The women walked slower now. They no longer clustered in the corners, whispering of the Führer's return or the lost glory of the Reich. They sat outside in the pale light of German spring, staring at nothing, their faces thinner, their expressions emptied of illusion. The projectors had done their work. In the weeks that followed, the Allies began releasing prisoners in small groups. Some were sent home to ruined cities like Hamburg, Cologne, or Dresden, cities that bore the same scars they had seen on screen. Others were reassigned to labor detachments helping clear rubble or tend to the wounded. For many of the women, stepping beyond the barbed wire was no return to freedom, but a deeper kind of captivity. The awareness that they were returning to a nation stripped of everything: pride, direction, certainty. Reports from British and American occupation authorities describe a striking behavioral shift among released female officers. Before the screenings, interrogations were filled with denial and deflection. "We didn't know," they would say. "We only followed orders." Afterward, their answers changed. There was less argument, fewer excuses. Some cried during questioning. Others simply said, "It was all lies." A U.S. Army report from the 7707 Psychological Warfare Division noted, "Exposure to visual evidence has a deeper and more lasting impact than verbal confrontation. The women express shame more freely than men, perhaps because their indoctrination was more emotional than ideological. The transformation was not uniform. For every prisoner who embraced remorse, another remained bitter, unable to reconcile the atrocities shown on screen with her own sense of duty. Yet even among the unrepentant, the certainty of rightness was gone. Something inside had cracked. The old rhetoric, the slogans of purity, obedience, and destiny, sounded hollow now, even to those who spoke them. In the words of a captured Wehrmacht nurse, "We had been proud to serve. Now we only wanted to forget." In post-war Germany, forgetting was not easy. The Allies ensured it wouldn't be. Newsreels continued to play across the occupied zones, projected in town squares and cinemas. The footage once confined to POW camps became mandatory viewing for civilians. Crowds stood under broken roofs, watching the same films that had haunted the women behind the wire. The death mills. Germany today, crimes of the Reich. Children clung to their mothers' hands. Men stared at the ground. The nation was being shown its reflection, and it was unbearable. For the women who had served the Reich, this public reckoning was doubly painful. They were reminded daily of their own complicity, not just as citizens but as functionaries. The clerks who stamped papers, the nurses who treated soldiers, the operators who transmitted orders. Their humiliation was intimate, not abstract. Many avoided speaking of their wartime roles for the rest of their lives. Others tried to rebuild by burying the past, marrying, changing towns, pretending to be someone else. But the images of those films lingered. The moving pictures that had first forced them to see had also branded them forever. Yet not all consequences were psychological. The Allied re-education programs began to bear visible fruit. Former POWs who had watched the screenings often became quiet advocates for change within their communities. A former Luftwaffe radio operator from Bremen began teaching children English using American pamphlets. A Wehrmacht nurse volunteered at a refugee shelter run by the British Red Cross. In their small unrecorded acts, the moral repair of Germany began. It did not start in courtrooms or in speeches. It began with individuals who had been broken by truth and were now trying, in their own way, to live differently. Meanwhile, the broader process of denazification unfolded across Germany. Allied Control Council directives removed Nazi officials from power, dismantled propaganda networks, and banned the display of swastikas. But beneath the bureaucratic surface, something deeper was taking root, an emotional shift that the POW screenings had helped ignite. The women who had once served as instruments of ideology were now witnesses to its collapse. Some were later interviewed by Allied sociologists studying post-war attitudes. One said, "The films made me sick. I hated them. But when I came home, I saw the same ruins and I knew they had not lied." For many of these women, the process of confronting truth did not end when they left the camps. It followed them into peacetime. Returning to homes reduced to ash, they found themselves in a country that no longer believed in the things they had lived for. They queued for bread alongside civilians who despised them, wearing coats that hid the insignia they had once worn with pride. Some found work as nurses again, others as clerks for the Allied administration. Slowly, they learned to exist in a new Germany built not on faith in power, but on fatigue and survival. The American and British officers who had overseen the screenings also reflected on what they had done. Many had entered the task believing in punishment, in making the enemy face guilt. But what they witnessed changed their understanding of victory itself. Captain Lawrence, who had led the Lübeck screenings, later wrote in his notes, "The point was never to humiliate them. It was to show them humanity. In the end, they learned more from the kindness of our nurses than from the horror on the screen." His words captured an unexpected truth, that redemption, not revenge, was the quiet victory of the occupation. Indeed, while the newsreels exposed horror, the daily conduct of Allied women, nurses, drivers, administrators had demonstrated something even more powerful. They treated German civilians with dignity. They smiled even at those who had once been their enemies. For many former German officers, this was the most bewildering revelation of all. The same women they had been told were weak, corrupt, or inferior now embodied compassion without fear. Their confidence, calm, and fairness dismantled the final myth of Nazi ideology, that strength required cruelty. Over time, this moral inversion began to reshape perception. When German women saw Allied women working beside men, earning respect through skill and service rather than obedience, it redefined the very meaning of womanhood in the post-war world. Some historians would later call this the invisible emancipation, the transformation of gender identity through defeat. The women who had been humbled by the screen would, in time, help build a society that valued honesty over fanaticism, empathy over ideology. The seeds were sown in the most unlikely soil, humiliation. But the cost of this awakening was heavy. Many of those who lived through the screenings never spoke of them again. Diaries, when they survive, mention sleepless nights, recurring dreams, or a strange sense of duality, the inability to reconcile who they were with what they had seen. One former communication officer wrote in 1947, "The faces in the film follow me. They look at me when I close my eyes. I tell myself I did not know, but the truth is, I did not want to know." Her confession echoed the collective guilt of a generation. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt. Cities rose from ashes, democracy returned, and the shadows of the war slowly faded from daily conversation. Yet beneath the new facades, the memory of those flickering films endured. The women who had once sat in the cold barracks watching Allied newsreels became mothers and grandmothers of a new generation, one that would grow up free from dictatorship but haunted by its memory. When asked decades later about their first realization of Germany's crimes, many would still answer the same: it was the films. For the Allies, the screenings were a small part of a vast occupation effort, soon overshadowed by larger political tensions. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the Cold War. But in the quiet aftermath of war, inside those barracks and classrooms, a transformation occurred that history books rarely mention. It was not written in treaties or military orders, but in human eyes. The moment when pride gave way to empathy and denial to understanding. The newsreels were more than documents. They were mirrors that forced a nation to see its soul. For those German women who had once served the Reich, that reflection was unbearable but necessary. Their humiliation was not an end, but a beginning. From the darkness of those screenings, Germany would begin its long journey back into the light of humanity. And so, as the final reels gathered dust and the camp gates opened, the women walked out into a world reborn. The sky above was the same, the ruins the same, but they were not. They had seen the truth projected in light and shadow, and once seen it could never be unseen. In the years that followed, the memories of those screenings faded from public record, but not from the hearts of those who had witnessed them. For the German women who once wore the Reich's uniform, the flicker of that projector became the dividing line between two worlds, the one they had believed in, and the one that truly existed. In the dim barracks where humiliation first struck, something else was quietly born. Conscience. It did not emerge from punishment or coercion, but from the simple, unbearable power of truth made visible. The faces on those reels and the prisoners, the soldiers, the children wandering among ruins, remained etched in their minds long after the films stopped rolling. For the Allies, victory was not only measured in territory or treaties, but in what those women became afterward. Many carried the weight of what they saw for the rest of their lives, yet it made them different. Gentler, more cautious, more aware. They raised children who would question power instead of worshiping it. They became part of a generation that slowly reshaped Germany's moral compass, turning it away from the illusions of superiority toward humility and accountability. The nation that had once glorified obedience now began to teach its youth about responsibility. In this transformation, the films played a quiet but pivotal role. They were never just moving pictures, they were confessions delivered by light. They taught that evil can wear the face of order, that silence can destroy as effectively as bombs, and that redemption begins only when denial ends. The women who had once believed in the righteousness of their cause became, through that confrontation, witnesses to their own awakening. And so, the story of those screenings and of humiliation, shock, and realization stands as one of the war's least celebrated victories, the triumph of truth over illusion. In the end, it was not the bombs or armies that changed hearts, but the courage to look, to see, and to understand. From that flickering light in a barrack room, a new kind of Germany began, one born not from conquest but from reflection.